Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
Why don't we just start off with your history? Kind of tell us where you're from and kind of run me through up just kind of the broad base of your background and what you've done in your life. I know. I guess maybe that's not the right question. Where did all this start? Where were you and you know, how did we get to be here kind of thing?
Well, I was born in what was Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, 1935, and grew up in Africa. And went to school there and so on, but really grew up in the Second World War dominating our lives. I'm busy writing a memoir on those years, right through till 84, and so that was the most active period of my life in many ways. I really describe that in that because where we are today is that we have a world in turmoil, basically global biodiversity loss and desertification as a consequence over 2/3 of the world, where the rainfall is seasonal, and that's fueling mega fires and climate change, and these are spiraling on each other. And we arrived in 1983 roughly at a way to solve that and an understanding of that problem. So I've written a memoir about that period and hope to get it out before the end of the year and really describe how a way to solve these problems, which is what I think the world desperately needs, could never have come from one person. It could never have come from any university in the world, any environmental organization or government or any one country. Nor could it have come at any other time in the history of the world. So where we arrived at arose from a unique set of circumstances, and that is growing up in a small country in Africa with an even smaller governing population of whites in the tail end of colonialism, the dying of the empire, civil war, strife over more than 20 years of my life, and being an ecologist engaged by government for the first 8 years of my life, then becoming an independent scientist because I found I couldn't do honest science in an institution because of the way institutions operate, all institutions. And so it was all of that, and then being forced into exile and being commissioned by far-sighted people in America to put 2,000 people through training, and it was that period of incredible learning with 2,000 people working on the framework for management to deal with the problem that I was developing, that finally we broke through. So it was an absolutely unique situation in the time of the world that allowed us to arrive where we did.
So we're going to get to what the problem is and have you really define it for me, but part of this upbringing you had was spending a lot of time in the bush in Africa. Talk to me about what it was like in that time of the world to be in the bush. What did you do? And if you would, kind of lead into what that ended up being as far as what you did during the Rhodesian Civil War.
Well, yes, my earliest ambition was to be a rear gunner in a bomber or a Spitfire pilot, but the war ended. And then I was leaning towards the military, but even though I was very, very immature, I at least reasoned out that there'd be at least 20 years peacetime soldiering, and I didn't want to be a peacetime soldier. And I reasoned out that the future warfare would probably be guerrilla warfare, not regular warfare. And so that became a hobby that I studied. But I went for my second love in life, which was just to be in the bush and with wildlife. And there I found a problem because you couldn't join a game department under the age of 25, and I was only about 16 when I was ready to leave school. So a godfather of mine who had come back from Burma, where he'd fought behind the Japanese lines, he had joined the Northern Religion Game Department, which was the biggest, best organized game department in Africa, and he persuaded me to go to university. I never wanted to. I wasn't an academic and never have been. So I went to university and became an ecologist, the new science of ecology, really more than anything, and went into the game department. But because of my the work I was doing was mostly hunting problem animals, elephants, hippo, man-eating lions. We had a lot of man-eating lions where I was. And I joined the game department at 20, so that was the job I did. But then I also had this passion for guerrilla warfare that I was studying, and whether you're battling against poaching gangs or guerrilla gangs is much the same in many ways. And so I became deeper and deeper, more involved in that. And then one way or another, ended up training the army to train trackers, and we became the first army, as far as I know, in the history of the world that didn't use native trackers, but trained our own trackers. And I did that because I found native trackers, it wasn't their fight. And the closer you got to the enemy, the more they inclined to lose the tracks. And I'd found that with hunting man-eating lions. The closer we got to the lion, the more the trackers tended to lose the damn tracks. So I realized I have to become a tracker. And I became fanatical about it, as many young people are. And that helped lead to a solution. It played a major role because there's actually a book that was put out by Liebenberg, a South African, on the art of tracking the origin of science. And I believe his thesis is right, that where science originated from long before we had any universities or academics, thousands of years ago, with the origin of science was from tracking, because you're doing an incredible amount of observation at a level that no humans normally do, and you're having to make deductions from the clues, which is basically science. And in the case of trackers over the centuries, thousands of years, if you're wrong, your family died. And in our case, training army trackers, if you were wrong, you died. So we couldn't afford to be wrong. Your deductions and your building on clues had to be pretty damn good. And that's science. So a major part, as I will bring out in the memoir, of solving this 10,000-year-old problem of what had caused 20 civilizations already to fail by this problem that's now global. We could never solve that problem, and a major part of solving it was actually through tracking. Yeah. Observation, and then long nights when you can't light a fire because you're so close to the enemy. And so you're lying in the rain, you can't sleep, and you're thinking. And I would find myself thinking, why was the tracking easy today, difficult yesterday? We were on the same soils, the same vegetation, and yet we had totally different tracking conditions. So what was the difference? And in every case, the difference was whether we were tracking through a national park, through a hunting area, through a communal land or native reserve, as we called them in Africa at that time, or whether you were tracking through a commercial ranch, made a world of difference to the ability to track people. And so it was the management of the land that was causing the difference. So then you begin logically thinking, well, what's different in the management, and what is it doing to the land that's making it either easier or difficult to track a person? You see,
So what was, that's fascinating. So what were the differences? And so when you knew you were going into an area that had been designated a communal reserve or community lands, where you were looking at something potentially as a national park, maybe in a boundary area, what was that difference that allowed you, what did you, obviously you knew what to expect based on?
Well, when you're tracking, it makes a great difference whether there's a lot of litter on the ground, which makes it difficult to leave signs. Makes a great difference whether you've got crusted soils or something's broken the crust. It makes a great difference whether there's a lot of standing vegetation and how old it is. Is it oxidizing because it's been standing for a year or two in the sunlight and so it's beginning to chemically break down, or is it fresh grass that's not as easy to break down? And then as you're tracking people, if I was tracking you, for example, I could guarantee you that if you're walking across a piece of savanna in Africa, you wouldn't, and you're calm, collected, nothing wrong with you, etc., you will not put your foot on a coarse plant. You'll put your foot subconsciously next to the plant. Now, if I find your foot is going on that coarse plant, and I can detect that because whether it's oxidizing, easily broken, whatever, okay, I now know there's something wrong. You're either lost, or you're moving at night, not day, or you're wounded, you're confused. There's something wrong, because otherwise you won't put your foot on that coarse plant. Now, if I find you're breaking the surface, as opposed to putting your foot down gently, whether I'm tracking a buffalo or a cow or a bison, doesn't make any difference. If you watch animals grazing, they move quietly while they're grazing. They put their foot next to a coarse plant. If I find the buffalo or the bison or whatever is putting its foot on the coarse plant, I know the behavior is changing. Why is the behavior changing? See, so you're logically thinking of these things. So I don't think any ecologist, to my knowledge, has ever had such a wonderful opportunity of 20 years of that.
Oh, that's fascinating. So stress, basically.
Well, just extreme observation, deduction, and damn it, you have to be right.
Yeah, because the consequences are huge. What I want to hit on here is you've watched my films, you've watched a lot of my videos, and what I want to try to do is kind of bring your perspective and have you kind of give me some input on what you thought about various films. Like we'll talk about Scotland film, we'll talk about Killing the Shepherd and stuff. And so, and what I want you to do is kind of bring it back to kind of, your observations and how that works and what your not only your thought process, but how you see the world and moving forward. And obviously The Last Keeper, the film in Scotland, was the latest one. You've watched that. I guess the question, this is war going on between urban and rural, and it's about, the urban people seem to glom onto this romanticized idea of rewilding, planting trees. Does rewilding work? And if it does or doesn't, and if you could kind of just paraphrase the question, does rewilding work?
Well, you'd have to obviously look at what rewilding involves, but let's take it assumes trying to leave it to nature as much as you can. And then you ask, does it work? Well, are you asking, does it work economically? Or are you asking, does it build biodiversity? Or are you asking, does it work to sustain communities? Take your pick. You've got to look at it from a narrow perspective. Now, most people are looking at it from the perspective of biodiversity. And if you're rewilding in roughly 1/3 of the world, it's the most powerful thing you can do. You rest, 1/3 of the world's land, I should say. You rest land that is perennially humid, England, France, east and west coasts of America, here in Florida, and biodiversity will return. It's more powerful than using machinery or chemistry or fire or any other tool available to humans. Now, if you do that in the oceans, the lakes, the rivers, the wetlands, the same applies. Biodiversity will return. Now, whether you can sustain humans and their culture is a different issue. That's what we deal with in my work. Now, if you look at 2/3 of the world's land, and bear in mind the rainfall in London or Paris is about the same as the rainfall in Joburg, but they're totally different environments. And that's why I showed a NASA picture of the world when I gave the TED talk that went to about 9 million people. And I listened to a woman years ago in California, Elizabeth Sartoris, and she gave a talk in which she showed a picture of the Earth and a little satellite up there orbiting, and she made a wonderful statement. She said, if you'd been in space and watching the Earth over the last few thousand years, you would have seen the greatest change, and you would have described humans as a desert-making species. That is a far bigger problem than even fossil fuels are. Because so when you look at the 2/3 of the world in which that is happening, the worst thing you can do is what people are calling conservation, rewilding. If you come to where I live in Africa, I'm surrounded by 30 national parks. Tragically, there are worst examples of biodiversity loss, desertification, leading to future pandemics, fueling climate change. That shouldn't be happening in national parks, but it is. And the World Wildlife Fund, IUCN, Nature Conservancy, all of them are not even asking the questions. Why? That's science. We're not even applying science.
You know, in Scotland, there's a big push to do away with, they seem to, it's easy to point fingers. So they talk about red deer overgrazing these habitats. The influx of sheep after, the 1750s with the Highland clearances that occurred. Is grazing a problem? And what I'm looking for here is to kind of tie that back into kind of how these lands have evolved over, the time of the eternity. In Scotland, for instance, are the red deer the problem? Are the sheep the problem?
No, in every case. I mean, I don't care whether we discuss COVID policy, whether we discuss immigration into America, whether we discuss war on drugs, whether we discuss biodiversity. In every single case, the cause is not grazing or livestock or fossil fuels. The cause is the way that governments develop policy, which dictates laws, taxation, regulations, everything. It dictates management at large scale in the world. Okay, the average human today cannot even make a toothbrush. It's made by a corporation. Everything we do at scale has to be done through an institution. And it is the way that institutions develop policy that's leading to the problem. So in the world you'll find, and you saw it in your films, an awful lot of blaming. One side blaming planting of trees, one side blaming deer overbrowsing, etc. And that blaming's been going on for thousands of years. Frankly, I got sick of it 60 years ago, sitting around the campfires in Africa, complaining, whining, and so on. But it's still going on in the world. And if we want to look to solutions, then you have to look at why is this problem occurring. It doesn't matter what you look at. War on drugs, increased drug use in America and spread violence to Mexico and across to Africa. War on noxious plants, weeds. In America, we spend over $1 billion a year. We haven't killed a single noxious weed in any state. We've poisoned the rivers, bankrupted the farmers, damaged the environment, damaged our economy, and we just keep doing it. So it doesn't matter which we look at of these things. Overgrazing is not the problem. Now, for centuries, it's been blamed for the desertification aspect of this problem. You can go back in ancient texts, I believe, and see them blaming the shepherds with too many sheep overgrazing the land, leading to the desertification and the desert sands that were overwhelming cities in the biblical world. Now, that was a belief because people could see it and it was obvious. They had lots of sheep and the deserts expanded. Now, that belief became a scientific truth, never to be questioned, until I questioned it in the 1960s and found we were wrong. That was a belief. There was no scientific evidence. So if you look at this question of overgrazing, I can guarantee you, because I've done it, I've read probably thousands of PhD dissertations on overgrazing the land, overgrazing, how it's due to too many animals. That's a human belief that's become a scientific truth. Now, none of these, all of them talk about overgrazing the land. And in the films you show, they talk of the deer overgrazing the land. You cannot overgraze land. You can only overgraze or browse plants. They need to distinguish. Now, when you look at overgrazing or overbrowsing of plants, it's not due to animal numbers. It's due to animal behavior and the frequency of biting. Now, a French scientist, pasture scientist, was the first man to discover that, André Voisin, and he published in 5 languages in Europe. And he looked at Scotland and England and Germany and everywhere. And he looked at, for instance, grazing systems, rotational grazing systems, to try to overcome the overgrazing problem. And what he found was it increased the loss of biodiversity. It wasn't working. And he was essentially the man who discovered eventually that the overgrazing was a function of time and not number of animals. And he solved that in a European environment of more humidity with a very simple planning process. He called it rational grazing. Rational, thought out, not rotational. Rotational is guaranteed to lose biodiversity. All right, so he learned that, and I picked that up from him, and that's why I was credited. And in fact got his book republished in America because it was being ignored. And everybody was mimicking his work and never crediting him. But that was a vital part of the problem. And so when I realized in the 1960s how wrong I'd been, because I was very, very fanatical and almost violent anti-livestock, and trying to develop the game ranching industry so that we could get rid of livestock and we'd put everything right by what they're calling rewilding today. And I didn't realize how wrong we were, but when I did and realized we had to use livestock, then the problem became, all right, how do you do it? How do you prevent the animals from overgrazing plants? All right, but also, by now, through the tracking and everything else I'd been doing, I'd realized you also have on the land sticks, stones, algae, capped soil, bare soil, litter, all of this that has to be dealt with. It is not just the living plants. So how do you get the right animal behavior where they're putting their feet on plants and not next to plants? And how do you also prevent them over grazing plants? And every way that livestock had ever been run by extremely knowledgeable pastoralists who were very aware of their connection to the environment, and they had transhumants and pastoralists mob grazing their stock, herding their stock, moving their stock, mimicking migrations, everything. No matter what they did, it led to desertification. So it was a hell of a dilemma. What were we to do? And then we'd had 100 years, roughly, of modern range science, very narrowly trained people coming up with various grazing systems. But as we discovered in Africa and then confirmed in America, that accelerated the rate of desertification. So desertification that took 2,000 or 3,000 years to occur in Africa under pastoralists, in New Mexico, for example, in America, occurred in 100 years, 200 years. Far faster in America, where we had more scientists. So something was going very wrong here. And to cut a long story short, I was finally able to solve that problem by not looking at any of the sciences, but looking at management, and looking at management, the way it was done in businesses, organizations, etc., all the management schools in the world, Harvard and others, and the libraries full of it. And all of that was too academic, too complicated for ordinary pastoralists, farmers, etc. And then logically I looked at the army, because I was busy engaged in a war as an army officer, and I just looked at the training we had as army officers following the European schools, mainly Sandhurst, and how had those guys solved this problem over 1,000 years? Because for 1,000 years they'd been dealing with the problem of rapidly changing conditions, unknowns, uncertainties, all of these difficulties in immediate battlefield conditions. But they had learned how to train men rapidly and fast when they called them up for war, how to come up with the best possible plan at a moment in time in immediate battlefield conditions. So that was similar to the complications I was facing with wildlife, livestock, soil, plants, animals in Africa. And so unashamedly, I just took the military, 1,000 years of experience, and said, these guys have solved it. All I've got to use is their technique and adapt it to a pastoral agricultural situation. Because battles had always been fought for an hour, half an hour, a day, a week, a short time. Whereas farmers, ranchers had to plan for a year, 6 months. In drier areas, they had to plan for 2 years or more. Pastoralists often planned their moves, as I found in Pakistan and on the Baluchistan border. I found they were planning their moves a year ahead to 2 years ahead by sending young men ahead, negotiating deals of where they could run their sheep, etc. All right, so how were we to deal with that? And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, if I just put it on a flat piece of paper, I can express 4 dimensions. And that solved it. So I used the military technique, which is don't try to deal with the problem, it's too complicated. Just break it into small components that the human mind can deal with easily. And these small components you deal with, forget it. Deal with it, forget it. Deal with it, forget it. Deal with it, forget it. And they build on each other if done in the right order, and you come out with the best possible plan right then. So I did that, and did that in the about late 1960s, with 2 ranchers who were my guinea pigs, and it worked immediately. And I promise you, we have never, ever had a single failure, because it's got 1,000 years behind it.
So I just got a couple more questions on Scotland, on the situation there. You know, you have this issue of trying to bring back forest in an area that's naturally lost forest over time, evolutionary processes. People are promoting the killing of deer, red deer. And as we know, like in elephants are a primary product. They're very important to that ecosystem as far as developing that edge areas where you get different types and age growths of forest and that different habitat. And deer do the same thing. Bison, things like that back in England back in the day, or Great Britain. What really happens if you do away with red deer, you do away from your herbivores on a landscape like that, which is, obviously there's a lot of rainfall, a lot of moisture, a lot of humidity. What's going to happen if they eradicate red deer from the landscape?
Well, it'll probably get worse. You're just eradicating another species, and biodiversity loss is already the greatest problem we face. And I don't know what more to say to you. It'll get worse. I wouldn't even go there. That's part of what's happening today, is these constant conflicts and arguments. We need to get beyond that. We need to start looking at the cause of the problem and solving it. So if I was involved there, I wouldn't even discuss that with them. I'd just not go there at all, because it's not going to solve the problem, so why waste time on it?
Well, they seem to talk a lot about biodiversity loss. And so like in a Scottish moor, you've been up in the heather uplands that are managed for game, so that's low intensity burning, suppression of ground predators. And where you do that, you see a pretty healthy population and of wide variety, especially of small mammals, birds, raptors, all that stuff. Where you don't do that, it seems, where you just kind of let nature be free and do its own thing. There's some science that says that you lose 50% of your biodiversity. Yet that's the calling card for the city people, is that there's these, they call them wildlife deserts, these grouse moors, yet these people don't go up on them. They're not witnessing anything. Again, this is back to that human social issue here. How do we get people in the cities to understand that it's okay to manage these lands, that if we decide what the solutions are, and of course, the keeper's working on different aspects of that, improving, by having new growth through fire, certain grazing that goes on. They're using sheep as tick mops to deal with ticks and disease and so forth. The ultimate is you end up with more wildlife on the landscape, both game and non-game species. How do we get people that live in that urban environment to understand, or should we be trying to educate people about conservation or managing these types of lands?
Yes, we should be educating people, obviously, because we've got a problem, but I wouldn't tackle it from that perspective, because that's been going on for a long time. I've been going grass hawking in Scotland 50 years ago, and saw these sort of things going on, and it's still going on. Now, if you want to get beyond that to solutions, yes, most of the power has gone to the cities now, the way the populations are developing. And people in the cities are out of touch with the realities in the countryside. So that's one of the things that needs to be cleared. People in the cities are antagonistic to hunting, killing, anything of that nature. Now, what they don't realize is if you, for instance, people who are vegans, that's wonderful. If they're vegans for spiritual reasons or health reasons, they believe. But if they're doing it for ethical or humane reasons, then they're doing great harm. Now, why do I say that? Because if we never killed another animal, and we left all animals to die naturally, we would be extremely cruel. Humane is a human concept. Nature is not humane. Nature is far from humane. I have had the tragedy of watching, through conservation, environmentalists, I've had to watch 50,000 head of game die, and it was tragic to watch. Now, how did they die? They die from starvation. It's bloody cruel. Or they die from parasites because in their weakened condition. It's bloody cruel. Or they die in their weakened condition from breaking a leg or sticking in the mud, and it's bloody cruel. Or if they're lucky, they die in the gentle jaws of a lion or a crocodile, humanely and fairly quickly. They have no other choice. They don't die peacefully in their sleep. People in the cities need to understand that. So if you come to where I am in Africa, my whole life has been built on my love of wildlife. That's what's driven me. And if you come to where I am, it's easy to raise money to fight poachers. Easy, because it's emotional. But poachers are not the danger. The danger is habitat destruction. So for me, and I'm saying this in all sincerity, I would never put $1 into an environmental organization, because far greater danger to wildlife where I live in Africa is the World Wildlife Fund, IUCN, African Parks, TNC, these big environmental organizations. They raise money on emotional issues. But where we have our national parks with hundreds of years old trees just dying, reed beds disappearing, all the species involved in the reed beds disappearing, riverbanks collapsing, bushbuck gone, many other species gone. We have that. They don't even come and visit. Or if they do, they say, oh, lovely, it's a national park. I saw these charismatic species. There's complete lack of curiosity about the terrible destruction of habitat. Now, animals can live far longer without food or water than they can without habitat, including humans. So what we need to do, yes, is to educate, but we don't need to get into blaming, because those people are well meant. So what I'm anxious to do is get us together dealing with the cause of the problem, and that is the way that environmental organizations, governments, universities, organizations like my own, all of us, how we develop policies. That is what is causing the problem, not bad people, not bad motive, but we keep attacking each other. If we address the cause of the problem and come together and say, okay, let's look at how we develop policies that lead to the laws or regulations, the management that is so destructive, if we come together there, in every case I've done it, in America, in Zimbabwe, in India, in Lesotho, in every case, even with people violently opposed to each other, we've suddenly found agreement and harmony and ability to solve the problem. That's what we need to bring about.
Great. Killing the Shepherd. That's the film I shot in Luanda. You've been there. You spent a lot of time, obviously, that part of the world, Luangwa. How can these remote African lands, do they need to be managed? And if they are managed, how can we ensure that we have it? And how do we create healthy ecosystems? And how do we end up having vibrant wildlife? Because it sounds to me like we need to have the wildlife in order to have the healthy ecosystem, because they go hand in hand. How can Africa and that part of the world, how can it move forward so that we end up with these positive outcomes, that we have these healthy ecosystems?
Well, you've got management at two scales. The human scale, that's you and everybody listening. They're managing their family, they're managing their finances, and then they're managing nature to produce something, whether it be music, beef, corn, wildlife, cell phones, whatever. All right, so you can manage at the human scale. Now, at that scale, they can only do the best they can. It's going to be impossible to solve the problem. The reason I say that is because you cannot manage your family or your community independent of the economy. And there's no economy in the world that can sustain any business, any government, any church, any university that's not based on the photosynthetic process, nature. Right, so these have got to be managed together. So at the human level, whether we're farmers, pastoralists, villagers in the Luangwa, we can only do the best we can. The reason I say that is because they're operating in an economy in every country, including America, in which global finance is driving environmental destruction. So frankly, you have an unwinnable situation. Our ship is going to be sinking. Now, how do you solve that? The second level of management is policy level, government, institutions, management at scale. If you look at a religion, you can be a Christian, you can be capable of care, loving, everything. Look at religion managed at scale, and you've got over 2,000 branches of Christianity that have been at war with each other for 2,000 years. Killing, maiming, going to war, etc. Protecting paedophile priests, going against their cause. Their very purpose. All right, so management's at scale, and that's what I'm talking about. How do we bring these institutions into managing and manage in the interests of citizens? Because every institution, political party, environmental organization, university, doesn't matter what you look at, its first task is to grow the institution and to finance the institution. If it doesn't, the institution fails, just like a family fails. Its third chance, if it's a political party, its third priority is to remain in power. Its fourth concern is the interests of the citizens. Now, you can go to a university. First, grow the university, finance the blah, blah, blah. It doesn't go to an environmental organization. Go to a farmers' organization. You've got the same situation. So those are the institutions we bring together representing stakeholders to develop policy. That's why every single policy is unsound. I'm not aware of a single sound policy, and if you look in my textbook, which is right behind your camera there, you'll find one of the most meaningful statements came from a group of 2,000 American scientists that I was commissioned to put through a week of training, and they said, we now recognize that unsound resource management is universal in the United States. So we're not going to address that problem until we address the cause of it. Because that's simple logic. Unless you address the cause of a problem, you'll never solve it. So we need to pay attention to that, I believe.
So we talked about the United States here. This next film I'm doing, The Real Yellowstone, about multi-generational ranching families, the relationship with the land, the wildlife, and several of the, I would say, the younger generation ranchers, 30, 40 somethings that are taking over these multi-generational ranches, are practicing bits and pieces or even large parts of your holistic management approach to the land. And many of them, again, they're talking about, they use the word rotational, but they're resting land, in some cases upwards of 2 years from grazing, but highly intensive, like, well, Sebring Livestock Company, 1,000 head on 100 acres for 24 hours, hammering these things. We talked about humidity, when we've discussed the subject here. Are these guys doing, I mean, they're seeing good results, but you mentioned that they could see even greater results if they did that. So what is it, do you think they're doing today that's okay, but what could it be, what would they need to do to get it to that next level?
Well, what they're doing is they're trying to, well, they are managing cattle and the land. That's what they're doing. Now, land is not manageable because it's so tied to the culture of the people, the economy, it can't be divided. And the cattle are just a form of production of food and fiber. All right, so what they're doing in that environment will be better than continuous grazing, reductionist management as was in the past. But they're still in reductionist management, and now they're using the animals in a more intelligent way. Yes, they're mimicking my work, and thousands of people are doing that in many countries around the world now. And it'll be better in those environments. But it will not be a solution to the global problem, because you can't take what they're doing and transfer it to Sudan or North Africa or right up into China and Mongolia, where it's desertifying badly. All right, so we need to be aware of that. They must not claim it as a solution, because it isn't. Now, they could do a lot better. Now, the way they could do better is just to go back to the original work and not try to manage the cattle and the land, but to manage their lives through the economy, their earning income, and the environment to produce the beef. Use the animals as a tool in that. Now, let me try and make that simpler. One of the big problems I found globally when I was working from small farms to, I think, the biggest ranching company ever in the history of the world that were clients of mine for 15 years. What I found was the biggest problem in commercial ranching, like you're talking about, is overcapitalization. And in America, that's particularly bad. The price of land is so high, you're tying so much money up into that land, that these people are running far too few animals to make it economical. So usually there's something else financing it. A big business, some other business, wealthy parents, something else having to finance it, or subsidies from government. So now what they need to do is start realizing that to overcome the fear of animal numbers, because you only solve that problem by producing much more yield per hectare. And what you'll find those ranchers almost certainly doing is focusing on the breed of cattle, the weaner weights, the conception rates, etc., the performance per animal. So if you go and sit in a coffee shop there and you listen to those ranchers, they're almost certainly going to be talking about the breed of cattle, the conception rates, etc. Now, if you were to move from that table and go and sit with a group of maize farmers, corn farmers, or soybean farmers, or tobacco farmers, or anything else, what would they be bragging about? They wouldn't be bragging about the brand of maize they're growing, type of tobacco they're growing, type of soybeans they're growing. They'd be bragging about the yield per hectare. They've got the bull by the horns. The cattlemen have got the bull by the udder. They need to focus on yield per hectare. Now, if they do that, they'll start to overcome the overcapitalization. And I would hazard a guess they're not doing that.
Well, and I think what I've noticed here is that you have two types of ranchers. So we have historically, these are multi-generational. So this is land that was acquired 80, 100 years ago, some cases 150 years ago, which is long for that history for Northern European colonization. So the basis of getting into the land is fairly low. And so so they're not looking at that cost per hectare or cost per acre acquisition price, because you're right now, that's one of the biggest problems we have in the West, especially since COVID. We've seen this huge influx of people moving into these rural areas and these rural towns, these towns that are in fairly remote parts of the West. And because of that interest in the allure and romanticism around ranching, Yellowstone, the television show, people are willing to pay much more per acre for the land than what it pencils out economically. So, we'll have areas south of Malta, which is in north central Montana, close to the Canadian border, where, that land, it's just not very fertile. And so you'll have ranches that literally 5,000 acres that can only sustain a herd of 120, 30 animals for a year. That's all they can yield out of that, just because of, that's just because of the environment only can sustain that many, is what these guys are telling me. But my point is, what I'm getting at is the actual cost per acre. Get something like that to pencil out. You can't buy it for less than, low hundreds of dollars an acre. And they're now selling in $1,000+ per acre. And so, but then you have this concept of trophy ranches too, where you've got these people, like you were explaining, money that's come from another source, an oil well, silver spoon, trucking company, whatever, inheritance. And so they're able to go and purchase these things and just basically turn them into recreational playgrounds. There's no real cattle ranching going on. These things only is sufficient to get the tax break. Yeah. So how do we cotton with all that? With your...
I keep saying, I will sound like a stuck gramophone record. I'll keep coming back to the policy. You said the land, that's all they can hold. Now, let me give you some stories. Okay? First, it's the way we look at land, or the way I look at land, and the way ranchers and range science look at land is different. Let me give you 3 examples of that so that you get it, because this is a very important point. The first came up with a ranch in Rhodesia. Rhodesia had the Natural Resources Board and probably the best conservation service in the world. It was modeled on the American one by Charles Murray, who came over to America, looked at what you were doing, and improved on it. And it was an incredible conservation service. And then the Natural Resources Board was a quasi-government body where we all had deeded land, but you didn't have the right to damage the land. And so this body under the court had people traveling around the country looking from the air, etc. And if you had severe gullies and erosion, you'd get a court order telling you to do something about it. If you ignored it 3 times, your land could be expropriated, even though it was deeded, because you don't have a right to damage the resource of the country. So it was a very advanced law. Now, the Natural Resources Board gave an award every year for the top best managed ranch. And it was won one year in 1960s by Jock Thompson, Colonel Thompson, the head of Meikle's ranches, with his private ranch, Clonmore. And Jock came to me and said, Allan, I've just got this top award for the best managed felt, as we called range, in the country. And I want you to give me an independent report. Are they right? So I went out to the ranch, got his managers to take me to the best parts of the ranch. I analyzed it, looking at it from an ecological point of view, not from a range science point of view. And I found that over 90% of the ground was bare and eroding. And that had just got the award for the top ranch in one of the most advanced conservation countries in the world. Looking at it differently. The second example came up in Sumas, in Namibia, the Sumas case. It was a court case. A fellow called Malcolm Kroon was having his land expropriated to make a Bastakavit, as they called it, a coloured area for settling people in the apartheid days, and he wanted me to represent him. A judge or somebody had recommended to get onto me because nobody would represent him against the governments and the universities. I agreed to do so, and we held they held the court case comparing his land, willing buyer, willing seller, with land that had recently sold at a certain price. And we had the specialists, in the top experts in Southern Africa, all with their PhDs, giving evidence. And I advised counsel on what questions to ask them. And I said, ask them if they know what soil erosion is, what forms of soil erosion there are, and is there any soil erosion on this ranch. They knew all the forms of soil erosion: gully erosion, rill erosion, sheet erosion, wind erosion. They answered it all. Is there any on this ranch? Absolutely none. They described it as perfection of management. I was put in the box and I said, I haven't seen the ranch, I can't testify. So they adjourned court for a whole day, and I spent it on the ranch taking measurements, taking photographs, developing the photographs in the night, having all the facts and figures for court in the morning. When court resumed, I was asked the same questions, answered them. Was there any erosion on this ranch? Yes. Here's the evidence, here's the data. There were grass roots over half an inch sticking into the air. A millimetre loss is 20 tonnes per acre. It was about 98% of the soil between plants was bare and eroding. And that had been described as perfection of management. It was appalling management. Now, the third case like that is when I mentioned to you I was commissioned when I came as an exile to America to put 2,000 people through training. Don Sylvester in the Soil Conservation Service, one of the men who headed our interagency committee, etc. We were coming back from a site I'd selected near Albuquerque. I'd selected a site as the most perfect example I could find in America of desertification. Crusted soils, eroding, oxidizing plants, no overgrazing at all because it was totally rested, etc. I'd picked this near the Sandia Mountains, and we'd go out there training these groups of 30 people at a time. As we were coming back, Don was chuckling like hell one day, and I said, "What's the joke, John?" And he said, "Oh, and you're not going to believe this." And I said, "What?" He said, "The site you have chosen as perfection of desertification in America is the exact same site that the U.S. Soil Conservation Service chose as perfection of management to be used in range science throughout America. Same site. Viewed by range scientists, viewed by an ecologist. So when you look at land, it depends on how you look at it. In the TED talk, I said, never look at grasslands like this. Look down. Because rain falls down. It doesn't fall like that. And you see it differently. So bear that in mind as we talk of these things. So, for example, when I looked at your films and you emailed me, etc., you said you'd visited the Bubi concession in Zimbabwe, and you talked about it yesterday, and then you travelled 400 miles, I think you said.
Save concession.
Save. Okay, I used to live down there and know what it was like in the Tsetse eradication days. And so, yes, that looked good by contrast with the neighbouring land, but it's deteriorating.
Yeah, no, I saw lots of open landscape with with exposed soil.
Yeah, so it's better than what you saw over most of the land, but you have to stop the deterioration. And we're not stopping it in national parks, we're not stopping it in communal areas, we're not stopping it on the best of ranches. The only place we have evidence of stopping it is where we've addressed the cause, by changing to holistic management.
Sticking to Montana, there's an outfit that I know you're familiar with, American Prairie, or American Prairie Reserve, that used to be called. It's a part of this story because they have this concept to buy within a 3 million acre land space. There's about 1 million acres of deeded land. This is old homesteading land that was the most fertile lowland areas that had moisture, had water on it. And they're using donor dollars, from what I understand, from what I can tell, about a dozen really deep-pocketed people, including some folks from Germany that have the Save the American Serengeti Fund. And they are, they got lots of time, got lots of money, and they're paying fair and square to buy these lands up. And they have this concept of having anywhere, depending on what paperwork you read, at between 10,000 and 30,000 bison that are going to free range over this 3 million acres, and that they envision grizzly bears and wolves rehabilitating, and managing these herds of bison. In your world, does that make sense? Does that work? And what do you think the outcome will be from that mindset and that type of management of the land?
Well, never mind what I think. What do your listeners think? What do you think? Does it make sense to bring in all these outside dollars to do that? Now you've got a large area of land that you've put under a few buffalo, and you hope some bears will come and some wolves will come. You'll increase conflict with neighbors, with the wolves, etc. You'll increase conflict when we need to get humans pulling together because our ship is sinking. The land will deteriorate. It will be better than it was, but it'll still be deteriorating. That's far too few animals. It's one species. It's not a range of species. Bison are no different from any other animal, whether you're dealing with elephants or African buffalo or bison or elk or whatever. If they're not able to roam with sufficient pack hunting predator change of behavior, the land will deteriorate. And how are you going to support people? You've got to support people economically. You've got to support the economy. Being real today. So really, that's a good effort. I wouldn't fault the motive. I think those people are very sincere, very genuine. But if they really want to solve the problem, I think they could do it with a fraction of that money, by just pulling people together and solving it. Because when ranchers understand more, they will not see the wolf as an enemy. We don't in Africa. I mean, if you come to our place, I've donated my ranch for the good of everybody, and the ranch was deteriorating when I bought it in the 1960s or 70s, and it had 100 head of cattle. It had no buffalo, no elephants, and it was deteriorating very badly, and the rancher was going broke. If he'd been a better rancher, he might have run 200 head of cattle. Now, it's won worldwide awards for the person or organization doing the most for the environment on a global scale, and we can't get environmental organizations to even visit. Now, we did that. Fences came down, elephants have come on, buffalo have come on. We did that by increasing the cattle just as a tool. Just using them as a tool, like a tractor that doesn't use diesel, but I can't park it. Doesn't pollute, but I can't park it. I've got to keep planning what I'm doing with it as a tool. And we increased the cattle by 400%, and we've produced that result. We've just come through 20 bad years. This year, the worst we've ever known. And right now, we're desperate.
This is drought you're talking about.
Yes. Right now, we're desperate. If you can put me on to somebody who can help us, we need to buy another 1,000 head of cattle just to keep pace with the production of the land. Why won't environmental organizations even come and have a look?
It's your answer. Why?
Institutions, they have to fund themselves, and what we're doing isn't emotional. It's emotional to raise money to fight poachers. We can raise money. People fund emotional stuff. I went to, and I'm not belittling her, I went to a gathering with Jane Goodall. Our careers started about the same time on Lake Tanganyika in Africa, and I'd never met her. Delightful woman, and we were both trying to raise funds at the same event, and it was amusing because she had a little cuddly stuffed ape, and she raised a hell of a lot of money to save these apes, and wonderful success. She's been equivalent of knighted for it, and it's wonderful success, but it's emotional stuff. Right now, I talked about saving all the wildlife, saving humans, saving the habitat for the apes, what will really save them, but it's not emotional. I didn't raise $1. We can't raise money for solving the problem. It's not emotional.
So don't we need to make it emotional?
That's up to people like you.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, obviously. You answered the APR thing fairly well, but you also talked to me about community, and that's a big part of what this film is about in the Rocky Mountain West, is about these rural communities and how the reliance on each other and how they pass information amongst each other. And I do think that that these ranchers are looking at how, I mean, their priority is take care of the land takes care of you, kind of thing. And so for me, I also see that byproduct, or that coattail effect, is the wildlife. You see much more species biodiversity where they're managing these lands. Whereas if you go down to a federal wildlife refuge in central Montana, where there's no grazing, there's no prescribed fire or anything like that, the amount of biodiversity is minimal. But also getting back to the APR thing, or American Prairie, you have a group of people that have a dream to save the prairie. And the ranchers are like, well, save it from who? Save it from what? And even when you look at APR's paperwork, it says 90% of the lands, there's no problem. That's their grazing lands that they want. It's the 10% that's actually been under plow in some of the bottoms of these drainages, these valleys. Should these people that are not from the area be pouring all this money? And you mentioned that you could take a fraction of money and achieve the same thing, and I know where you're going with it, but how could these people, what would be a good solution to getting all these people together? So buying land is one solution, because then you can tell people what you're going to do. Yeah. But there's other solutions there that would cost a lot less money, and at the same time a lot less conflict. So how do you think that this I have a friend who's now on the board for American Prairie. The new chairman, Bill Hill, as I understand from my friend, it's John Banovich, the artist. You may have heard of him, the wildlife artist, pretty famous. But a guy named Bill Hill, who ran the Paul Allen companies, Bill Gates, Paul Allen. So we're doing billions of dollars. But John tells me that Bill is a international big game hunter. International big game hunter. Travels around the world hunting lions, elephants, sheep, whatever he's hunting. And I'm hoping to interview him. But how could these guys use, since I've got a couple of guys that are serious hunters and understand the importance of wildlife and the landscapes and being good stewards of the land, how could we help steer the effort to be more productive and end up with a much better end product, the solution to it? How could we do that?
I'm not giving a casual answer. I've been working on this for 70 years. All right, so this is a deeply thought out response I'm giving you. You are facing the same issue we are in the Savory Institute, and everybody is. You are one of the leaders of the world, the people that get new information out to the public. The leaders aren't people like me who come up with new concepts. They're meaningless unless you get them out to the public. So you've got two options ahead of you, really only one, but I'm offering another. You can keep on doing what you're doing, interviewing people like me, interviewing hunters, interviewing ranchers, etc., and trying to spread the awareness that we could be hunting more, we could be doing this, that, and the other. And now you've got a big mass, it's David versus Goliath, of 8 billion people. You represent how many percent?
1,
1, 2,
Yeah, not even that.
Okay.
Yeah.
They believe in production of food and fiber, which is what wildlife management is part of, and forestry. Agriculture is the production of food and fiber from the world's land and waters. Okay, they believe in corporate production through chemistry and technology. So that's what you're up against. So you can keep trying to convince people with better films, and you're very good at it. Now, if you increased your success 300%, 20 years from now, how many people would be convinced that we need to change? What percentage?
Well, if it's 1 or 2%, it would only be 1 or 2%.
Your ship's sinking. You haven't got time. All right, so what you're doing is the best you can do. And it's the same with us in the Savory Institute. We've adopted this strategy of focusing on the world's grasslands, savannas that are desertifying, because if a government in the world begins to address climate change, which none are doing at the moment, then that's where we'll get the biggest return to humanity altogether, and quickest, is because the grain-growing areas of the world are not former forests. They former grasslands, where you get the deeper soils. All right, so we're focusing on there. That's the best we can do. And it's the right strategy. But I keep warning our own people, the same as I'm saying to you, that if you read the research of people like Lord Ashby, Reconciling Man and Nature, he looked at how does truly new knowledge get into British American society, democratic society. And he found if it's truly new knowledge, such as we're talking about today, all right, it is never accepted by institutions until people at the cricket ground in the bar are saying, when the hell are they going to change? In other words, public opinion, majority of it has swung. And that, in his research, takes 100 to 200 years. So I've been roughly 50 years at it since we got the first breakthrough, and I've made almost zero progress. Although, yeah, I've made some progress around the world. There are 50 hubs now practicing holistic management in 30 countries, but it's still, we're preaching to the choir. So we can keep preaching to the choir, but our ship is going to sink. Young people don't have the time. At the rate that chaos and violence is increasing associated to these problems, including immigration changing the face of Europe, immigration here, etc. They're all part of the same problem. All right, so that's our one alternative. And looking at that, and my age, I'm 89 now, so when I buy something and they tell me it's got a 5-year guarantee, I say, thanks, that's a lifetime guarantee to me. All right, so what can I do in the rest of my life? I don't want to waste my time on this any longer, because I know the ship is sinking. I'm a realist. What I want to do is to solve it. Now, we can solve it easily. And I spoke about that at COP26. I said, look, the world leaders don't know what to do. They need help from every conference, whether it's Davos or the COP26 to COP100, or whatever you look at. You're just getting chaos and conflict coming out of it. World leaders need help. So what we need to do is pick an issue like this, national parks. Just pick a simple issue like that. Everybody in the world, it's neutral. They want national parks to succeed. The motive is good, the idea is good, but as I said, the parks around us are our worst examples of desertification and problems. So why don't we just persuade one country and the US National Academy of Science, the Royal Society, to just get behind it, and we just get one country, could take my country, Zimbabwe, and just get the president to agree to work with the World Wildlife Fund, the various Nature Conservancy, all these big ones, and let us solve this problem together. Let the president just carry on governing as at present, because politicians cannot take risk. But just let us do an exercise backed by the big environmental organizations and the government, and see if we can develop a different policy. Now, if we do that, the downside, if it doesn't work, is we waste $1 million, we waste a year. If it works and it's internationally observed, we will save billions of lives, cities, every business in the world, which is not sustainable till agriculture is. So the upside is enormous. That's what I'm suggesting.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.